She was 15 years old, and she was already a ghost. Not because she was dead, not yet, but because the system that was hunting her had already decided long before she was born that people like her did not deserve to exist. No judge ever read her a sentence. No firing squad ever raised their rifles in her direction. There was no trial, no gallows, no single bullet with her name on it. And yet by the spring of 1945, Anne Frank was gone, killed just as deliberately, just as coldly as if a court had ordered it. This is the story of how a regime can execute a child without ever pulling a trigger. This is the story of the last 7 months of Anne Frank's life, the months her diary never got to tell. Most people know Anne Frank as the girl in the attic. The girl with the red plaid diary, the girl who wrote about boys and arguments with her mother and the impossible boredom of hiding in a few small rooms above an Amsterdam canal. But that diary stops abruptly on August 1, 1944. 3 days later, the door of the hiding place was kicked open, and the story most people know simply ends. What happened after is rarely taught, rarely shown, and almost never discussed in the same breath as the diary itself. It deserves to be. To understand how it ends, you have to understand how it began. Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1929, into a Jewish family that was, by every measure, ordinary. Her father, Otto Frank, was a businessman who had served Germany in the First World War. But ordinary stopped mattering the moment Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. Within months, Jewish families across Germany watched their rights disappear one law at a time. The Franks did what hundreds of thousands of others did. They ran. They moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, hoping that a new country and a quiet life would be enough to outlast the storm. It wasn't. In May of 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, and the same machinery of persecution that had driven the Franks out of their homeland followed them across the border. Jewish children were barred from regular schools. Jewish-owned businesses were seized. Curfews, identification badges, travel restrictions, the noose tightened slowly, then all at once. By the summer of 1942, the Nazis began mass deportations of Dutch Jews to so-called labor camps in the East. Few people understood at the time what that really meant. Otto Frank understood enough to be afraid. He had spent over a year quietly preparing a hiding place behind his office on the Prinsengracht Canal, a set of hidden rooms accessible only through a bookcase that swung open like a door. On July 6, 1942, after Anne's older sister Margot received a callup notice to report for labor service in Germany, the family disappeared into the rooms they would later nickname the Achterhuis, the secret annex. They were joined soon after by the Van Pels family and later a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer. 8 people in total, sealed away from daylight, sealed away from the world. For 2 years, they lived in near total silence during business hours, dependent entirely on a handful of brave employees who smuggled in food, books, and news. Anne filled that time the way countless teenagers might have given a diary, and an extraordinary amount of forced stillness, she wrote. She wrote about her fears, her family, her first kiss, her dream of becoming a writer or a journalist after the war. She wrote famously that she still believed people were truly good at heart. She wrote it not knowing what was coming. On the morning of August 4, 1944, German security police and Dutch collaborators climbed the stairs behind the bookcase and arrested everyone inside. To this day, historians have never definitively confirmed who betrayed the hiding place. Suspicion has fallen on warehouse employees, a Dutch Nazi Party member, and various informants over the decades, and in 2022 a team of investigators reignited public debate by pointing to a Jewish notary who may have given up the address to save his own family, a theory that was later challenged and remains unproven. What is certain is only this: someone talked, and within hours 2 years of careful silence ended in handcuffs. The 8 people from the annex were taken first to a Gestapo headquarters, then to prison, and finally to Westerbork, a transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands that the Nazis used as a holding pen before deportation east. Because they had been in hiding rather than cooperating with earlier deportation orders, they were classified as criminals and assigned to forced labor, breaking down old batteries in a punishing daily routine. It was miserable, but compared to what came next, Westerbork was almost survivable. On September 3, 1944, Anne, her family, and the others from the annex were loaded onto what would be the last mass transport train to leave Westerbork for Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland. The journey took 3 days, packed into cattle cars with no food, no water, and a single bucket for sanitation shared among dozens of people. When the doors finally opened on September 6, the infamous selection process began on the platform, a brief, almost casual glance from an SS doctor deciding, in seconds, who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. Anne, her sister Margot, and their mother Edith were judged fit for labor and spared the immediate selection. Otto Frank was separated from his wife and daughters and sent to the men's camp. It was the last time he would ever see any of them. Inside Auschwitz, Anne and Margot endured the standard horrors of the camp, their heads shaved, numbers tattooed onto their arms, starvation rations, brutal roll calls that could last hours in freezing or scorching weather, and constant grinding fear. Survivors who later remembered the Frank sisters from this period described two teenage girls trying, almost impossibly, to hold onto some shred of normalcy and care for each other amid the chaos. That period did not last long. In late October 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and the Nazi regime grew desperate to keep its labor force moving away from the front, Anne and Margot were selected for transfer not to a gas chamber but to another camp deep inside Germany, Bergen-Belsen. Their mother, Edith, was left behind at Auschwitz. She would die there in January 1945, just weeks before the camp's liberation, from starvation and exhaustion. Bergen-Belsen had not originally been built as an extermination camp. It had functioned earlier in the war as a prisoner exchange camp. But by late 1944, as the Nazi camp system collapsed inward under the pressure of Allied advances on every front, Bergen-Belsen became a dumping ground for tens of thousands of prisoners evacuated from camps further east. The population exploded far beyond anything the camp's infrastructure could support. Food deliveries stopped almost entirely, clean water disappeared, sanitation systems failed completely, disease unchecked and unmedicated tore through the overcrowded barracks. It was in this collapse that Anne and Margot Frank arrived, sometime around late October or early November 1944, and were housed in a section of the camp without proper shelter, without adequate clothing for the brutal winter ahead, and without enough food to keep a healthy adult alive, let alone two teenage girls already weakened by months of deprivation. A survivor named Jannie Brands-Brilleslaper, who had known the Frank sisters from Auschwitz and encountered them again at Bergen-Belsen, later gave one of the only first-hand accounts of their final weeks. She described two girls reduced to skeletal figures, dressed in rags, shivering uncontrollably, infested with lice, the exact conditions in which typhus, a disease spread by body lice, thrives and spreads with terrifying speed. By early 1945, a typhus epidemic had erupted across Bergen-Belsen, fueled directly by the camp's catastrophic overcrowding and the total breakdown of sanitation that the Nazi administration allowed to happen, and in many ways engineered through deliberate neglect. There was no medicine. There was barely any food. The disease causes high fever, delirium, and eventually organ failure, and it moved through the starving, weakened prisoner population like wildfire. According to survivor testimony, Margot Frank, severely weakened, fell from her bunk in the final days of her illness and died from the shock of the fall combined with her advanced typhus. Anne, who had been caring for her sister despite being gravely ill herself, died only days later. Camp records and survivor accounts place her death sometime between late February and mid-March 1945. She was 15 years old. There was no gas chamber, there was no firing squad, there was no order signed by a single officer condemning her by name. And that is precisely the horror of it, because what killed Anne Frank was not one decision but thousands of them, made by an entire system designed to work people, starve people, and discard people until disease finished what bullets didn't have to. It was an execution carried out not with a weapon but with a policy: deliberate overcrowding, deliberate starvation. Deliberate denial of medicine, of sanitation, of basic human shelter to people the regime had already decided were expendable. Typhus was the immediate cause of death. The Nazi system was the architect of the conditions that made that death inevitable. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, barely a month after Anne Frank died. The soldiers who entered the camp that day described scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Thousands of unburied corpses, tens of thousands of survivors too sick and starved to stand, a stench of death so overwhelming that some soldiers vomited on sight. Anne missed liberation by weeks. So did Margot. So in Auschwitz had their mother. Of the 8 people who had hidden together in that small annex above the canal for 2 years, only Otto Frank survived the war. When Otto returned to Amsterdam in June 1945, he learned piece by piece that his entire family was gone. It was only then that Miep Gijs, one of the employees who had helped hide the family and who had quietly gathered Anne's scattered papers from the floor of the annex after the arrest, handed him his daughter's diary. Otto Frank had not known it existed in this form. He read his 15-year-old daughter's private thoughts for the first time as a grieving father, alone in the city where she had once hidden in plain sight. He later said he never truly knew his daughter until he read her words. He chose to publish it, not as an act of vengeance but because Anne herself, in the final months before her arrest, had heard a radio broadcast urging Dutch citizens to preserve their wartime diaries and letters as historical records, and had begun rewriting her own entries with publication in mind. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted people to read what she had seen and felt. Otto Frank gave her that after she could no longer ask for it herself. The diary was first published in 1947 under the title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex. It has since been translated into more than 70 languages and read by tens of millions of people, making a teenage girl who died in a typhus ward one of the most widely read writers of the 20th century. The house on the Prinsengracht still stands today. The bookcase still swings open. Visitors still climb the same narrow stairs Anne climbed in 1942 and stand in the same small room where she wrote that she still believed, despite everything, that people were good at heart. She wrote those words without knowing what Westerbork, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen would do to her. Whether she still believed them in her final days in that freezing, disease-ridden barracks is a question no one will ever be able to answer. But the fact that she was capable of believing it at all, even for a moment, in the middle of a system built entirely to prove her wrong, is perhaps the most quietly devastating part of her story. Anne Frank was never given a trial, she was never given a sentence, but she was executed all the same, slowly, methodically, by a regime that didn't need a courtroom to decide who deserved to live. Her diary survived because of one woman's quiet courage in picking papers up off a floor. Her death is a reminder that genocide doesn't always look like a single bullet. Sometimes it looks like a denied ration, a crowded barracks, a withheld vaccine, a system engineered to let disease do what soldiers were too busy to finish. If this story moved you, that's exactly the point of telling it. History like this isn't meant to just be watched and forgotten, it's meant to be remembered, carried, and passed on so that the people who lived it are never reduced to a name in a textbook. If you want more deeply researched, honestly told stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And before you go, drop a comment below and tell me what part of Anne Frank's story you never knew until today. Let's make sure her words, and the words of everyone who never got the chance to write their own, keep being read.